The afternoon sun hung low over the small town when Marcus Hayes pushed open the glass door of the police station, his boots dragging softly against the tile floor. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, his skin dark and weathered by decades of sun and hard living, his jacket faded at the elbows and patched at one pocket. He carried nothing but a manila folder, and the quiet, steady posture of a man who had learned long ago that patience cost nothing. He had come for one simple reason. His wallet had been stolen outside the hardware store that morning, and he needed a report filed so he could replace his driver's license. Nobody in that building could have guessed, from the sight of him, that within 5 minutes his life would be turned upside down in front of a dozen strangers. The station smelled of stale coffee and old paper, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, a ceiling fan turning lazily above the waiting area, though it did little to move the heavy afternoon air. A few plastic chairs lined the wall near the entrance, one of them missing an armrest, and a bulletin board behind the counter displayed faded notices about neighborhood watch meetings and a lost dog nobody had ever found. Marcus approached the front desk and waited without complaint, while two officers finished a conversation about lunch plans. When one of them finally turned to him, the young officer's eyes swept over his clothing, his scuffed boots, and the rusted Ford pickup truck visible through the window in the parking lot outside. There was a flicker of judgment in that glance, quick and automatic, the kind that required no words to be felt. Marcus set his folder down and calmly explained that his wallet had been stolen, along with his identification and a small metal box he always carried in his coat pocket. The officer, whose name tag read Coleman, asked to see what was inside the folder, more out of boredom than procedure, and Marcus obliged without hesitation, because he had nothing to hide and had never once in his life needed to hide anything. Inside the folder were old photographs, a laminated military identification card with the edges worn soft, and a single silver star pinned to a faded ribbon. Officer Coleman stared at the star for a long moment, then laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that carries more cruelty than humor. He held up the card and turned to his partner, calling out that the man standing before them claimed to be a general, as if the words themselves were a punchline. Two more officers wandered over from their desks, drawn by the sound of laughter, and soon a small crowd had gathered around the counter, each one taking a turn, to look at the identification card and shake their head. Marcus stood perfectly still through all of it, his jaw set, his eyes calm, saying nothing in his own defense, because he had learned, many years earlier, that dignity does not require an audience to remain intact. Officer Coleman leaned over the counter, still smiling, and said that if Marcus Hayes was really a general, then he himself must be the President of the United States. The other officers chuckled again, and one of them reached out and picked up the metal box, turning it over in his hands, as though it were a child's toy, rather than something a man had carried through war zones and hospital beds and funerals for men who never came home. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and even, asking only that someone take his report about the stolen wallet so he could be on his way. Nobody answered him directly. Instead, Officer Coleman told him to stay right where he was, because in his professional opinion, wearing military decorations without proper authorization was a federal offense, and impersonating an officer was not something the department took lightly, regardless of how quiet or polite the man standing before them happened to be. Within minutes, two officers stepped around the counter and asked Marcus to place his hands behind his back. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned, exhaled slowly, and allowed the cold metal of the handcuffs to close around his wrists while the small crowd of officers watched, some smirking, some already turning back to their desks as though nothing unusual had happened at all. As he was led toward the back hallway, Marcus glanced once at the folder still lying open on the counter, the silver star catching a thin ray of afternoon light, and something in his expression suggested not fear, but a tired, familiar disappointment, the kind that comes from watching history repeat itself in a uniform he once wore with pride. A few onlookers near the entrance, ordinary citizens waiting to file their own reports, exchanged uneasy glances. One elderly woman shaking her head slowly, as though she had seen this particular scene play out before, in one form or another, more times than she cared to count. Nobody in that waiting room spoke up on his behalf, and Marcus did not expect them to, understanding all too well how quickly a crowd could turn into an audience for someone else's cruelty without ever intending to. The interrogation room was small, painted a dull shade of gray, with a single table bolted to the floor and a camera blinking quietly in the corner. Marcus was seated across from two officers, Coleman and a heavyset sergeant named Dale Pruitt, both of whom seemed convinced they had caught something significant. Pruitt slid a notepad across the table and asked Marcus to explain, in detail, where he had obtained the medal, the identification card, and what he intended to do with them. Marcus answered plainly, stating that the items belonged to him, that he had served for over 30 years, and that the wallet containing his current identification had been stolen that same morning, which was the entire reason he had walked into the station in the first place. Pruitt did not seem to hear him. He leaned back in his chair and remarked that men like Marcus tried this kind of thing more often than people realized, buying costume medals online and wearing them around town for the attention, hoping someone might offer them a free meal or a discount at the hardware store. Officer Sandra Whitfield, a younger officer standing near the door, had already pulled out her phone and begun recording, later claiming it was standard procedure, though nothing about her posture suggested procedure so much as curiosity dressed up as duty. She murmured to another officer that people should not think dressing up like a soldier was a clever way to fool anyone in that building, and a few heads nodded in agreement, as if the matter had already been settled before it had even begun. The camera in the corner blinked its small red light, indifferent to the tension building inside the room, and somewhere down the hallway, a coffee machine gurgled and hissed as another shift began, without ever pausing to consider the man seated quietly under fluorescent light. Pruitt tapped his pen against the notepad, repeating his questions in slightly different phrasing, as though rewording an accusation might somehow make it more true. Marcus remained composed throughout the questioning, answering each accusation with the same unhurried calm, never once raising his voice or shifting in his seat. He did not argue about the medal or the identification card, because he understood that no argument would change minds that had already closed. Instead, he made a single, simple request, one he repeated twice more when it was ignored the first time. He asked to be allowed one telephone call, not to a lawyer, not to a relative, but to a specific number connected to the Department of Defense. Pruitt burst out laughing at that, slapping the table with his palm, and told Marcus that of course he could call the Pentagon, right after he called the moon, and the room filled again with the same mocking laughter that had followed Marcus since the moment he walked through the front doors. Whitfield lowered her phone for a moment, glancing at the older man's face, something in his stillness giving her the faintest flicker of unease, though she pushed the feeling aside just as quickly as it arrived. Pruitt stood and told Marcus that he would be held while they verified his identity through the system, and that if his story turned out to be false, additional charges would be added for wasting police time. Marcus nodded once, folded his hands on the table, and said nothing further, watching the door close behind the officers with an expression that betrayed no anger, only the quiet, patient resignation of a man who had waited out far worse than a locked room and a pair of handcuffs. Through the small wire-reinforced window in the door, he could see the hallway lights flicker faintly, and somewhere beyond that, the muffled sound of officers laughing again, their voices rising and falling in easy conversation, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their small, ordinary afternoon was already beginning to shift. Officer Coleman sat down at his terminal to run the fingerprint check that Pruitt had ordered, expecting the process to take only a minute or two, before confirming that Marcus Hayes was exactly what he appeared to be, a man with no legitimate claim to the rank he had displayed. He entered the print data and waited, drumming his fingers again. Screen returned a single line of red text that made him sit up straighter, but instead of a name and a criminal history, the screen returned a single line of red text that made him sit up straighter. It read simply, "Access denied," followed by a notice that the file was restricted at a level his clearance could not reach. He assumed it was a glitch, some outdated software error the department had been meaning to fix for months, and he ran the search a second time, more carefully this time, making certain he had entered every digit correctly. The second attempt produced the same result, the screen freezing for a moment, before locking him out entirely, forcing him to restart the terminal from the login screen. Coleman called over another officer, a technician named Greg Sutter, who examined the machine and shrugged, saying he had never seen a restriction code quite like that one before, and that it usually meant the file belonged to someone whose records were sealed at a federal level far above local access. Coleman muttered that it had to be some kind of malfunction, because there was no reasonable explanation for why a man in a torn jacket, sitting quietly in a holding cell down the hall, would have a file locked away behind federal security clearance. Marcus sat in that cell without complaint, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on a small square of light coming through the narrow window near the ceiling. He had spent enough years in briefing rooms and command tents to recognize the particular silence of people who were beginning to sense they had made a mistake, even if they had not yet admitted it to themselves. He did not call out, did not bang on the bars, did not ask again for his phone call. He simply waited, the way he had waited through long nights overseas, trusting that certain systems, once triggered, moved forward on their own schedule, regardless of what any single officer in a small town station believed. At around that same hour, a federal agent named Thomas Riley happened to walk into the station on unrelated business, delivering paperwork connected to a separate investigation his office was running in the county. As he passed the holding area, he glanced through the small window in the door and stopped mid-stride, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man seated calmly inside. Something about the posture, the stillness, the particular way Marcus held his shoulders even while sitting, struck a chord of recognition in Riley's mind, though he could not immediately place where he had seen that bearing before. He turned to ask a passing officer who the man was and why he had been detained, but before he could receive a full answer, Captain Frank Dillon stepped out of his office and instructed everyone to continue standard procedure, insisting there was nothing unusual happening and that the situation was already being handled. Riley had spent enough years in federal service to trust the quiet instinct that told him something was wrong, the same instinct that had once flagged a forged signature buried inside a stack of otherwise ordinary documents, and he found himself glancing back over his shoulder twice more before he reached the front doors. There was a particular stillness in the way the man in the cell had been sitting, spine straight, hands folded, eyes fixed calmly on some middle distance, that reminded Riley of officers he had once briefed early in his own career, men who carried themselves as though every room they entered was still, in some small way, a command post. He told himself it was probably nothing, a coincidence born of a long day and an overactive imagination, but the feeling lingered all the same. Riley hesitated, his instincts telling him that something did not add up, but he had a schedule to keep, and no formal authority in that particular case, so he continued down the hallway to deliver his paperwork, promising himself he would ask more questions if the opportunity arose again. Meanwhile, in the small office at the rear of the building, Captain Dillon stood staring at his own computer screen, having personally attempted to override the fingerprint lockout, only to receive the same red warning that had stopped Coleman twice already. He rubbed the back of his neck, told himself it was nothing more than an aging system overdue for replacement, and ordered that Marcus remain in custody until someone from the county office could come by in the morning to sort out the paperwork properly. By early evening, Marcus asked once more for his telephone call, and this time, worn down by the accumulating strangeness of the afternoon, Captain Dillon reluctantly agreed, if only to prove to himself that nothing would come of it. He led Marcus to a small phone in the hallway and stood close by, arms crossed, expecting to hear a rambling excuse or a call to some relative who would beg for his release. Instead, Marcus dialed a number he clearly knew by memory, waited 3 rings, and spoke 6 words in a tone that was suddenly sharper and more precise than anything the officers had heard from him all day. He identified himself by name and rank, then recited a short sequence of letters and numbers, calling it authentication code Delta 7, before falling silent and listening. On the other end of the line, a young operator at a secure desk hundreds of miles away froze at the sound of that code, immediately placing the call on hold and alerting a duty officer without explanation. Captain Dillon, still watching, saw nothing but silence stretch on for nearly a full minute, And it was that silence, more than anything spoken aloud, that first planted a genuine seed of doubt in his chest. Marcus hung up the phone, without another word, thanked the captain quietly, and allowed himself to be led back to the holding cell, his expression unreadable, as though he already knew precisely what was coming next, and felt no need to hurry it along. Barely 10 minutes later, the department's secure line, an old red telephone that sat untouched in Captain Dillon's office for months at a time, began to ring with a sharp, insistent tone that made every officer within earshot go quiet. Dillon answered it himself, and a composed, unfamiliar voice on the other end asked to confirm his identity before requesting immediate confirmation that a man named Marcus Hayes was currently being held at that station. Dillon confirmed it, his voice betraying the smallest tremor, and the caller instructed him, in a tone that allowed no argument, to release Marcus Hayes from custody at once, and to make no further inquiries into his identification until additional instructions arrived. Dillon, still clinging to his authority, asked who exactly was giving him orders inside his own precinct, and the voice on the line answered plainly that this was the Pentagon, and that a colonel would be calling back shortly to explain the situation more fully. Dillon set the receiver down slowly, his hand not quite steady, and for a long moment he simply stared at the old red phone, as though it might ring again and take back everything it had just said. Word of the call spread through the building faster than any official announcement could have managed. Officers pausing mid-conversation, glancing toward the holding cells, murmuring questions that nobody could yet answer. Somewhere beneath the disbelief and the mounting unease, a quieter thought had begun to take root in more than one mind. The uncomfortable possibility that the tired man in the faded jacket, the one they had mocked and cuffed and laughed at only hours earlier, might be exactly who he claimed to be all along. Barely had Captain Dillon set the receiver down when the red telephone rang again, and this time the voice on the other end was ice cold, carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. The caller did not raise his volume, did not need to, and simply stated that General Marcus Hayes was to be released immediately and treated with the full respect his rank demanded, effective the moment those words left his mouth. Dillon, still clinging to a shred of stubborn pride, asked the caller to identify himself and offer some proof that this was not an elaborate prank being played on his department. The voice answered without hesitation, stating plainly that he was speaking as the Chief of Staff of the Army, and that failure to comply would result in consequences far beyond anything a local police captain could imagine. The room fell utterly silent. Officers who had been whispering near the front desk stopped mid-sentence, their eyes fixed on Dillon's pale face as he gripped the receiver with both hands. Somewhere in the background of the call, Dillon could hear the faint rustle of papers and the low hum of a room filled with quiet authority, a sound entirely unlike anything that existed within the walls of his own small station. Before he could respond, his computer screen flickered to life on its own, an encrypted message arriving through a secure federal channel that none of his officers had ever seen activated before. Attached to the message were documents that made his stomach drop. An official military service record, a photograph clearly taken years earlier, a verified authentication code matching the very sequence Marcus had spoken into the hallway phone, and a digital signature that traced directly back to the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Every detail matched. The photograph, though younger, unmistakably showed the same steady eyes and squared jaw of the man currently sitting in a holding cell down the hallway. Dillon scrolled through page after page, his hands trembling now, without any attempt to hide it, reading citations for valor, records of classified deployments, and a service history stretching back more than 3 decades. Officer Coleman, standing just behind him, leaned in to read over his shoulder and felt the blood drain from his own face as the reality of what they had done settled over him like a physical weight. Somewhere down the hallway, Marcus Hayes sat exactly as he had all day, calm, unmoving, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that truth, once set into motion, rarely needed to be rushed. Years earlier, in briefing rooms lit only by the glow of tactical maps, Marcus Hayes had been known by a different kind of reputation entirely. One built not on medals displayed for others to see, but on decisions made under pressure that few people would ever fully understand. He had commanded operations in regions where mistakes cost lives instantly, and mercy had to be measured against impossible odds, leading units through missions that remained classified decades after they concluded. Soldiers who served beneath him spoke of him rarely, and only among themselves, describing a commander who insisted on walking point himself rather than sending younger men ahead, who carried wounded soldiers on his own back through terrain that swallowed lesser men whole, and who had personally coordinated the rescue of more than 200 captured soldiers during an operation that still, to this day, remained too sensitive for public record. Those who served under him remembered small details more than grand speeches. The way he checked on wounded soldiers personally before allowing himself any rest. The way he learned the names of every recruit within a week of taking command, and the way he never once raised his voice, even in the worst moments of combat, believing that panic spread faster than any enemy fire, and that calm, steady leadership saved more lives than bravado ever could. For those actions, and others like them, Marcus had been awarded the nation's highest military honors, decorations that most soldiers only read about in history books, yet he had never once displayed them publicly, never spoken of them at dinner parties, or used them to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. When politicians and generals alike had approached him about transitioning into a public role, offering him positions that came with staff cars, security details, and considerable influence in Washington, Marcus had declined every single offer without exception. He told the few people who asked that he had spent his career serving quietly, and he intended to end it the same way, without cameras, without applause, and without the trappings of power that so often corrupted the very ideals soldiers were meant to protect in the first place. When he finally retired, Marcus chose to disappear into an ordinary life with a deliberateness that surprised even those who thought they understood him. He moved to a modest house on the edge of a small town, bought a used pickup truck instead of anything newer, and began keeping mostly to himself, working occasionally on small repair jobs for neighbors and tending a garden behind his house that had become, over the years, something of a quiet source of pride. He carried no bodyguards, employed no drivers, and lived in no grand residence befitting the rank he had earned. He wanted, more than anything else, to be seen simply as a man, judged not by stars on a shoulder, but by the ordinary decency of ordinary days. And for years, that was precisely how the town had known him, though few had ever truly known him at all. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man who fixed a fence without being asked, who helped push a stalled car out of the rain one winter evening without ever mentioning his name, and who sat alone most Sunday mornings on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise over rooftops that had never once asked him who he used to be. Back at the station, Captain Dillon stood frozen in front of his monitor, the confirmed document still glowing on the screen before him, and for the first time all day, he felt something close to genuine fear settle into his chest. His mind raced backward through every moment of the afternoon, the laughter at the front desk, the handcuffs closing around a decorated general's wrists, the mocking questions in the interrogation room, and he understood with sudden, sickening clarity that none of it could be undone. Around him, the station had gone eerily quiet, officers standing in small clusters near their desks, whispering with the particular tension of people who suspected their careers had just taken a turn none of them could control. Somewhere behind him, a radio crackled with a routine dispatch call about a broken taillight, the ordinary business of the town continuing on entirely unaware of the storm quietly gathering inside the small brick building. And for a moment, the contrast between that mundane static and the gravity in the room felt almost unbearable. Officer Coleman, the young man who had made the first joke about impersonation, stood near the front counter with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, unable to stop replaying his own words in his mind, the ones about being president, if Marcus was truly a general. His face had lost its earlier smugness entirely, replaced now by the pale, hollow look of someone realizing too late that mockery has consequences it cannot always predict. Sergeant Pruitt, who had led much of the interrogation, sat heavily in his chair, staring at nothing in particular. His earlier confidence completely drained away, leaving behind only the quiet dread of a man waiting for a verdict he already suspected would not favor him. Officer Whitfield moved quickly to her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the video application and deleted the recording she had taken earlier in the interrogation room, hoping against reason that erasing the footage might somehow erase the mistake itself. She did not realize in her haste that a backup copy had already synced automatically to a departmental server minutes earlier, a detail that would resurface in the following weeks in ways she could not yet anticipate. Outside the station windows, the first indication of what was coming arrived not with sound, but with light. The sweeping glare of headlights cutting across the parking lot as a convoy of vehicles began pulling in from the main road, moving with the unmistakable discipline of an organization accustomed to precision. Two black military police vehicles rolled to a stop first, followed by a pair of dark sport utility vehicles bearing federal plates, their doors opening in near-perfect unison as uniformed personnel stepped out onto the pavement. A final vehicle arrived moments later, and from it emerged a tall officer in a formal uniform, his insignia catching the last light of the evening sun, his expression composed but unmistakably serious as he crossed the parking lot toward the station entrance without a single wasted movement. Every officer inside the building who happened to glance through the front windows felt the same identical wave of dread pass through them, the sudden and undeniable realization that whatever consequences awaited them were no longer a possibility, but an approaching certainty. The glass doors of the station swung open, and Lieutenant General Robert Ashford stepped inside with the calm, deliberate authority of a man who had walked into far more dangerous rooms than this one, and never once lost his composure. Behind him followed two aides and a representative from the Department of Defense, their footsteps echoing sharply against the tile floor, drawing every eye in the building toward the entrance. Ashford did not raise his voice, did not need to, and simply asked, in a tone that carried the weight of absolute expectation, to be taken immediately to General Marcus Hayes. Captain Dillon, his earlier bravado entirely gone, stumbled over his own words as he led the way down the hallway, apologizing before he had even finished forming a coherent sentence. When the holding cell door opened, Marcus rose slowly to his feet, his expression calm, almost gentle, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all that day. Lieutenant General Ashford stepped forward and rendered a formal salute, holding it with perfect precision, and Marcus returned the gesture with the same quiet dignity he had carried since the moment he first walked through the station doors that afternoon. Ashford then turned toward the small crowd of officers gathering nervously near the hallway entrance, his eyes sweeping over each of them in turn, and announced in a clear, measured voice that due to a serious violation of protocol involving a retired general officer of the United States Army, the entire unit present in the building was to stand at attention immediately. The order landed like a physical blow across the room. More than 30 officers, some still in the middle of paperwork, some frozen mid-step in the hallway, straightened their posture and came to attention almost in unison. Years of instinctive discipline overriding whatever confusion or shame still churned beneath the surface. Ashford instructed them further, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, ordering every officer present to render a formal salute to General Hayes as a gesture of the respect that should have been extended to him from the very first moment he walked through their doors. Hands rose in unison across the station, dozens of officers holding rigid salutes toward a man they had mocked and handcuffed only hours earlier, the sound of shuffling feet and drawn breath, the only noise in an otherwise silent building. Marcus stood quietly amid the sea of raised hands, his own posture straight but unassuming, and after a long moment he lifted his hand in a brief, understated return salute, the gesture of a man far more interested in the moment ending than in prolonging any sense of triumph over those who had wronged him. He said nothing further in that instant, offered no speech, no declaration of vindication, simply lowering his hand and turning his attention toward gathering the folder that still sat, forgotten, on the front counter where this entire ordeal had begun. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have, settling over the station like a verdict already understood by everyone present, whether or not it had yet been spoken aloud. Somewhere near the back of the room, Sergeant Pruitt lowered his raised hand only after everyone else had already done so, as though some part of him hoped the moment might stretch on just long enough to delay whatever conversation was certain to follow. and Officer Whitfield stared down at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the man whose humiliation she had once tried to capture on video for reasons she could no longer fully explain, even to herself. In the days that followed, senior officials from the Department of Defense arrived to conduct a formal review of the incident, and it became clear almost immediately that Marcus intended none of the outcomes his humiliated officers had feared. He declined every offer of a public apology ceremony, turned down proposed financial compensation from the department, and specifically requested that no criminal charges be filed against any of the officers involved, despite clear grounds for disciplinary action under federal guidelines. When asked directly why he would extend such mercy toward men who had treated him with such casual cruelty, Marcus answered simply that punishment alone rarely taught anyone anything of lasting value, and that he would rather see genuine change than watch careers destroyed for the sake of satisfaction. He did offer one request, delivered quietly to the assembled officers during a brief meeting arranged at the department's insistence, asking only that they learn to extend basic respect toward every citizen who walked through their doors, regardless of the clothes on their back or the vehicle parked outside. The room where they gathered was the same briefing room where officers usually reviewed shift assignments and traffic patterns, its walls lined with faded maps of the county, and yet it felt entirely different that afternoon, charged with a solemnity none of them had expected to carry into such an ordinary space. Captain Dillon stood near the back, arms crossed, listening more than speaking, having already decided in the days prior that his role in this particular meeting was to absorb the lesson alongside his officers rather than to shield them from it. A younger officer among them, one who had said little during the entire ordeal, finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had clearly been weighing on many of them since the moment the trucks pulled into the parking lot. He asked why Marcus had never simply announced who he was, why he had allowed himself to be handcuffed and questioned and mocked rather than ending the humiliation with a single sentence about his rank and service. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering, his expression thoughtful rather than bitter, and told the young officer that rank had never been the thing that gave a man his worth, that stars on a shoulder or medals in a box meant nothing if the character beneath them could not stand without such decoration. He explained that he had wanted, in some quiet way, to see how the department treated an ordinary citizen who arrived with nothing but the truth and a request for help, because that treatment, more than any uniform or title, revealed the true character of an institution meant to serve everyone equally. The room remained silent for a long stretch afterward, officers glancing at one another, several visibly wrestling with the weight of a lesson none of them would soon forget, understanding at last that the measure of a man had never been found in his identification card, but in the steadiness with which he carried himself when nobody believed he deserved it. Word of what had happened at the station eventually reached far beyond the small town where it began, carried first through official channels, and then through local newspapers that picked up fragments of the story from officials who could no longer keep it entirely contained. Reporters requested interviews from every angle, hoping to capture a dramatic account of a decorated general wrongfully arrested and later vindicated by the full weight of the Pentagon. But Marcus consistently declined nearly every request that came his way, granting only a single brief conversation to a local journalist he had known for years and trusted to tell the story honestly. In that conversation, he refused to dwell on his own suffering or humiliation, redirecting every question instead toward a broader point he seemed far more interested in making to anyone willing to listen. The reporter, a woman named Ellen Marsh, who had covered small-town stories for nearly 2 decades, without ever once encountering something of this scale, later admitted that the interview felt less like a conversation with a war hero and more like sitting across from a man entirely unbothered by his own extraordinary history. He told the reporter plainly that people should be careful about judging others by the vehicle they drove or the condition of the clothes on their back, because appearances revealed nothing true about a person's history, their sacrifices, or the quiet burdens they carried without complaint. He added that dignity was not something granted by rank or title, but something every person deserved simply by virtue of walking into a room and asking to be treated fairly, and that any institution built to serve the public owed that basic respect to every citizen equally, without exception. The station itself, under considerable pressure from both federal oversight and the quiet moral weight of what had occurred, issued a formal public apology within the month, acknowledging the failures in judgment that had led to the wrongful detention of a decorated veteran. Alongside the apology, the department announced a series of mandatory retraining sessions focused on bias, procedure, and the treatment of citizens, regardless of appearance or circumstance, along with new internal protocols requiring far greater caution before detaining any individual on suspicion alone. Captain Dillon, who bore the heaviest weight of responsibility among all who had been present that day, chose not to wait for a formal reprimand, and instead stepped forward publicly to accept full accountability for the failures under his command, a decision that, in the eyes of many who had once doubted him, restored at least some small measure of the respect his department had lost. Marcus, for his part, never asked for any of it, content simply to return to the quiet rhythm of his ordinary life once the formalities had finally concluded. On the afternoon, he came back to the station one final time, not out of obligation but simply to retrieve the paperwork for his replaced identification. The building felt different than it had weeks earlier, the atmosphere quieter, more careful, the officers who passed him in the hallway offering nods of genuine respect rather than the dismissive glances of before. As he walked back out toward the parking lot, where his old pickup truck still waited exactly where he had left it weeks earlier, Officer Coleman happened to be standing near the entrance, and without a word, the young man straightened his posture and offered a slow, deliberate salute, holding it far longer than protocol required. Marcus paused, studied the young officer's face for a moment, and this time, unlike the tense formality that had filled the station weeks before, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile before returning the gesture with quiet warmth. He climbed into his truck, the engine coughing once before settling into its familiar rhythm, and pulled slowly out of the parking lot as the late afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement behind him. Nobody in that small town would ever again mistake the quiet man in the faded jacket for someone unworthy of basic respect. And the lesson his ordeal had carved into that department would linger long after the headlines faded and the cameras stopped calling. In the end, the story was never truly about medals or rank or the authority of a single telephone call from Washington, but about the simple, enduring truth that respect belongs to every person who walks through a door, asking only to be treated fairly, and that the ones who have earned the greatest honor are so often the very ones who never feel the need to prove it at all. Somewhere along that quiet stretch of road, the taillights of the old pickup truck grew smaller against the deepening orange sky, the town shrinking behind him into little more than rooftops and church steeples silhouetted against the coming dusk. Marcus rolled the window down halfway, letting the warm evening air move through the cab, and for a moment his mind drifted back not to the handcuffs or the mockery or the flashing lights of the convoy that had once filled that parking lot, but to something far simpler. The memory of his own father telling him, decades earlier, that a man's character was measured only in the moments nobody was watching. He had carried that lesson through jungles and deserts and briefing rooms lit by pale fluorescent light, through medals pinned to his chest by presidents, and through quiet nights spent alone with the weight of decisions no ceremony could ever fully honor. And he carried it still, driving home in a truck with a dented fender, wanting nothing more from the world than the chance to live simply and be treated fairly. The town, in its own imperfect way, had learned something that afternoon it would not soon forget, a lesson passed quietly from officer to officer, from parent to child, from one ordinary conversation to the next, that the measure of a person could never be found in the clothes they wore or the vehicle they drove, but only in the steady, unseen decency they carried through a lifetime of days when no one was keeping score. And somewhere out past the edge of town, where the road curved gently toward the horizon, and the last light of the sun spilled gold across the fields, an old soldier drove home in peace, asking for nothing, owed everything, content simply to be, once again, just a man,